Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and let me join others in welcoming you to the post. I hope for a favourable disposition from all your decisions. When I became a minister in 2007, one of the first events that I recall was the whole ministerial team sitting in Bute House listening to the Chief Medical Officer, Harry Burns. And Harry Burns was talking to us about the effect of poverty on very young children and how that would blight their existence for their whole life. So in his opening remarks, the new Cabinet Secretary, John Swinney, putting early learning at the heart of what he wanted to say to us, chimed absolutely with what Harry Burns said to the ministerial team in 2007 and resonates with me to this day. Because if we don't get it right at the beginning, we sure as heck will get it wrong at the end. So I very much welcome all the initiatives that there will be, supporting mothers back to work, supporting children before they get to school, and increasing the investments in communities where there are particular needs due to social and economic circumstances. I, like John Mason, will pursue one or two of my obsessions. I will continue from time to time to suggest to any education minister that the Trachtenberg system for mental arithmetic is worthy of further consideration. I myself was a pretty indifferent student at all levels of my studying. Fortunately, I was brought up in a house filled with books, and essentially I am an autodidact, self-taught. I therefore have no one to blame for my shortcomings but myself. I represent an area with substantial rural communities, and it's interesting to go around the schools and see how different they are from the schools in urban communities. The relationships between teachers and the pupils quite different, more intimate, more knowledge on both parties of what's going on. The response I get to one of my standard questions I ask when I'm at a rural primary school is I ask everyone who's driven a tractor to put their hand up. And the really good news is in the majority of cases these days, there are more of the young girls in the rural schools put their hand up to having driven the tractor than the young men. And if that tells us anything about some of the things that are changing in society, that's good. I have longer run experience of rural schools. My grandfather started teaching in a rural school in 1881 as a pupil teacher, ending his career in 1926 in Pedison School in the Black Isle. The world was very different. There was a single teacher school, even though there were over 20 pupils. My grandmother made soup for the pupils from the vegetables that the pupils themselves brought to the school. The infrastructure was very limited. Today, schools are resourced in a very different way and work in very different buildings. Education is not now simply face-to-face. It can be online as well. And that's important for rural communities and for tertiary education in these communities. That's why it's important we get rural broadband up to the speeds that we require. And I very much welcome the commitment that the government has made to provide 100% of premises in Scotland with rural broadband by the end of this parliamentary session. My wife in particular is looking forward to that. As she reported to me yesterday, broadband was running at 50 kilobits per second. It's also, of course, worth thinking how important communication is more generally for rural communities. The Romans were a much more successful empire than the Greeks because they had an effective system of communication. The Greeks did not. The Romans could get a message from Londinium to Roma in 24 hours by a system of hilltop signalling. Thankfully, we've moved on a little bit from that. But let's remember that as recently as 1957, the very first speech call was made across the Atlantic. That was something in my living memory. I remember my father having to make a call across the Atlantic in 1958 in relation to a patient that he had. In my constituency, tertiary education is at a lower level the lower proportion of my constituents have a tertiary qualification than most of the constituencies in Scotland. Now, that's been for a good reason historically, because lots of school leavers have been able to go straight into employment. The world in future is going to be more difficult, and education is going to play an important role in helping people into new jobs, into new long-term employment. And that's why I particularly welcome the substantial investment there's been in the North East College in Fraserburgh. The campus there is gleaming and efficient and ready for the 21st century. And of course, the number of apprentices that, I'm in my last minute, Mr. Johnson, the number of apprentices now has risen dramatically. And that is because we're focusing on the tertiary sector, delivering people that are fit to work. That helps the economy, but it helps individuals. And a rural area like mine particularly benefits from the policies of this government. Please keep it up, Education Secretary.